All right, folks, today we're talking about learning. And this is not learning like you might think about it. This is about how we learn behavior. So, how do we learn behavior? Well, behavior is one of those things a little different than like what we might talk about with memory or learning facts or math problems. Behavior is learned basically through three different ways. And, we call this type of learning associative learning, which basically means it's us making associations between either stimuli and between stimuli itself, between our behavior and consequences, or it's actually watching and like learning through observation. All right. Today, we're going to talk about a very specific type of learning, the classical conditioning, which is simply associating stimuli with other stimuli. So let's take a look. This classical conditioning was initially started by Ivan Pavlov, and he was a Russian physiologist. And the reason why he figured this out was because he had dogs and he was looking at salivation and digestion. And in order to do that, he needed to make dogs salivate. And what makes dogs salivate? Food. Okay. And so what he would do is he would feed them and then he would collect their saliva in these tubes. But he had a bell on the door that entered into the dog enclosure. So anytime he walked in, the bell would ring, and that kind of like told the dogs, "Oh, we're being fed." And so eventually they figured it out. They learned the bell meant food, and they would salivate earlier and earlier. And so Ivan wondered about this, and he set up an experiment in which he basically tried to get the dogs to associate food with something he called a neutral stimulus, or something that really didn't mean food, right? So it was a bell, a tone, he had a metronome, he did a lot of different things. But let's kind of dive in a little deeper and learn about this vocabulary, because this is going to be really important. The vocabulary for understanding the problems that are in your your classwork packet. All right. So the first actual vocabulary word we need to understand is, what is a neutral stimulus? Neutral stimulus is anything that doesn't mean really anything, right? So, and it doesn't elicit any response. So, for instance, it could be a bell, it could be a flash of light, it could be a puff of air. It's really just doesn't really mean anything to anybody, but it's a stimuli. It's like a type of stimulus in the environment, right? So it's something that you can sense, but doesn't mean anything to you. Okay. Now, the other vocabulary that we have to understand is things like the unconditional response. Well, think about it this way: response is right. You're going to do something now. In classical conditioning, an unconditional response is usually a physiological response, which means like salivation. It could be kind of your creating tears, if you will. Right, when if you get something in your eye, you are going to create tears in response to that, right? And so anytime anything gets in your eye, you're going to cry, right? Just like anytime food is put on your tongue, you're going to salivate. It's an unconditioned response. It happens anytime a particular stimuli is present. Okay. And so an unconditioned stimulus is the thing that triggers the unconditioned response, right? So if we're looking at Pavlov's experiment, Pavlov tried to get dogs to learn that other stimuli meant food. So he would use a bell, a metronome, right? Use a lot of different things. So he'd ring a bell, present food, and then, eventually the dogs figured out that that bell meant food. So in Ivan's particular experiment, a bell was a neutral stimulus, didn't mean anything. Food was an unconditioned stimulus because it always meant salivation, which was an unconditioned response. Okay. Now, at some point, okay, the dog is going to figure out this bell means food is coming. And as soon as the dog learns the bell means food, when the bell rings, the dog will have what is called a conditioned response or a learned response, and it will begin to salivate. Okay. So, for instance, if every time before I give you something to eat, I ring a bell, then what's going to end up happening is eventually that bell is going to trigger you to feel hungry, and it's going to trigger salivation. And so once that happens, you salivating to the bell is now a conditioned response because you learned that that bell meant food. Okay. And the bell now was once a neutral stimulus. It now becomes a conditioned stimulus. Okay. And the conditioned stimulus is something that was previously neutral, but now actually triggers something. All right. So on Ivan's experiment, okay, the bell was a neutral stimuli, the food was an unconditioned stimulus, and salivation was an unconditioned response. Okay. But eventually, the dogs figured out the bell meant food. So when the bell would ring, they would salivate, and their salivation was now conditioned because it was being triggered by the prior neutral stimulus, which is now the conditioned stimulus. And I know that seems very complicated, but just remember that unconditioned means learned and or unlearned, excuse me, and conditioned means learned. All right. So here we have a kind of look at it, and this is Ivan's experiment. We can see here we have got the dog. We have food triggers salivation. The food is the unconditioned stimulus. Salivation is the unconditioned response. Then Ivan would ring a bell or a tone. Right. He would just make a tone. Doesn't do anything. Dog would be like, yeah, that's great. Okay. But eventually, what he did was, yeah, there's my dog. Eventually, what he did was he'd ring a tone, present food, and he would do it very quickly after. And again, the tone is still neutral, the food is still unconditioned, and the salivation is still unconditioned because the salivation is happening to the food. But eventually, once this tone triggers the salivation, the tone now becomes a conditioned stimulus, and the salivation becomes a conditioned response. All right, moving on. So let's talk a little bit about what some more vocabulary here. This is a very vocab heavy type unit. Acquisition is basically just when you actually acquire the learning. So what that means is as soon as that neutral stimuli triggers the unconditioned response, you now have acquisition. It takes time, but this is when you are linking a neutral stimuli with the unconditioned response. So when Ivan rang the bell and presented the food, this was called an acquisition phase. Okay. And eventually it will cause the neutral stimulus to trigger the conditioned response. Okay. You have to make sure if you're doing classical conditioning that the neutral stimulus has to happen before the unconditioned stimulus. Otherwise, there's no learning that will eventually happen, right? Okay, so that's very important. Okay. And in general, when you're doing any type of conditioning, the more biologically adaptive the conditioning is, the faster it'll be learned. All right. Now, there are some things that can happen um, after you classically condition something. Right? If it's your dog, or even you can even do it to humans too. But eventually, if let's say I link a tone with food, and so I ring the bell, I ring a tone, and you salivate. If I don't present food, um, for a little bit of time after, like after the tone, like let's say I ring a tone, aha, I made you salivate. That was so funny. Ring the tone, aha, I made you salivate. But I don't present food. Eventually, what's going to happen is you'll get extinction, in which the conditioned response, well, the dogs will basically learn that that conditioned stimulus will no longer mean the unconditioned stimulus, right? So if you don't present food after the tone, after you've classically conditioned them, eventually they'll have extinction, and basically their conditioned response will no longer occur. Okay. Um, so now it's important to also note is that sometimes you can have what's called spontaneous recovery. So this basically means that the conditioned response will appear randomly, and only like a little bit. It won't happen like a ton, but it will appear randomly after a conditioned stimulus. Okay, so spontaneous recovery can only happen after extinction, and that's an important note to remember. Okay. Um, when we talk about classical conditioning, there are things that can occur specifically like generalization in which, let's say there are similar stimuli to what you taught, whoever. So, instance, like let's say the bell that I rang was in the tone of C. If I had a tone that was very similar to the original one, you might get the exact same response from it. So, for instance, my dogs, anytime there's a knock at the door or anytime the doorbell rings, they bark and go crazy. So, this they don't generalize like, they generalize a lot in terms of like you can knock on the table, which does not sound like the door, and they will go and they will bark their heads off, thinking that it's the door. So they've generalized stimuli that's very similar to someone knocking at our door or the doorbell, and will always have the same response to it, and they'll bark their heads off, right? And so this is something that can happen, and you can actually train them not to. Um, by kind of like just basically teaching them that certain stimuli doesn't mean what the one stimuli means. Well, that's called discrimination, right? So you can teach them that, the doorbell at the door, doorbell on TV is different. You can teach them that the knock at the door and the knock on the table is different. And that's called discrimination. Okay. All right. So in your notes, what I want you to do is explain how you might classically condition someone or a pet. Try and use all the vocab terms you can. Work with someone nearby to do this if you can. And then, folks, what I'm going to ask you to do is then to work on the classical conditioning pages in your homework packet. All right, folks. I'll